Thank you guys. So I know I'm the last person stopping you guys between sort of lunch, so I'll try to make this hopefully informative, hopefully entertaining, but most importantly, hopefully useful for you guys. So I'm going to talk a little bit about startup ecosystems. Barack, thank you for having me back, actually. So this is the second time I'm coming back, and very, very happy to be here. So let me jump into this. All right, so first, just you always have to establish some credibility. I live in San Francisco, but a little bit of my background. So I'm actually a venture partner of 500 startups, which I'll talk a little bit about. I'm actually a mentor at 16 different accelerators in Europe, in the US, as well as in Israel. I actually sit on a bunch of boards and advisory boards of different startup companies in the ad tech and e-commerce space and media. And I actually spent 10.5 years at Yahoo. So I've actually come to the venture capital world in a very unorthodox way. And I guess 500 Startups is a very unorthodox organization, but I actually spent close to 6 years traveling between San Francisco and this region. So I used to run the many countries here in the MEA region for close to 4 or 5 years. So I spent a lot of time out here. And this is actually one of my favorite regions across the globe. So first thing, 500 Startups, we're a global seed fund. A little bit of a stat. So we have invested in over 680 companies. It's probably higher than that now because Dave's been traveling for the last couple of weeks. So every time when Dave travels, we end up having more companies show up in our portfolio that we don't know about. So we actually are based in Mountain View in San Francisco. We have about 30 people in the company, so we have 4 managing partners, and we have 8 investment professionals, myself included, and we also have a fairly big team, support team. We have people who our edge, in our view, is distribution. So we actually have a team of about 3 people who basically focus on working with our portfolio companies and teaching them the latest in sales, marketing, and distribution, online distribution, which we think is one of the big edges, and that we can help arm our companies to get more customers and get more money, drive more revenue. All right? Okay. So the question and what I was actually asked is about how to build the next Silicon Valley. And I actually think, having spent a lot of time in all these different ecosystems, it's actually the wrong question to ask. Because frankly speaking, there's this very good writer. He's a VC out of the U.S. His name is Brad Feld, who's actually done a lot about building startup ecosystems, and he calls it Silicon Stupid. Right? The reality is that most places will not be like Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is a very unique place that was close to 60 years in development, 50 to 60 years in development, and so the likelihood of likelihood of regions becoming like that are not realistic. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this. This is an article and a report actually done by a friend of mine. His name is Benjamin Joffe. He's based out he's lived in China and most recently in China, but he spent a lot of time in Singapore. And he's actually originally from France, but he's actually one of the best thinkers actually in this space. And so let me jump into some of the stuff he said. The framework of how you think about building a tech ecosystem is, the market, right? How big is the market? Whether it's small or large, that has some effect on the type of companies that are actually built, which I will talk about. The other piece is capital. I'll also go into a little bit more detail about this. The people, the entrepreneurial culture, and this is one thing I'm going to stop to talk about, is this is really, really important, because I think if you look at certain countries which have natural sort of like trader mentality, and there are certain cultures that are just much more friendly for entrepreneurs than other ones. And so examples I use, like the US is a very business and entrepreneur-friendly culture. The country I actually grew up in was Canada, is not a very entrepreneur-friendly culture. Other cultures are very entrepreneur-friendly. Israel is one. I also think Estonia is another one, which is very, very business-friendly. These all have massive effects. I think there's going to be a panel later on this afternoon on Japan, and I wish there was one on Korea, which is very interesting. Korea is an incredibly anti-entrepreneurial culture. They basically, and that's one of the challenges Canada, even Australia, a lot of the Commonwealth countries, where there's more of a focus on, or France is another one, right? Which is the country that actually coined entrepreneur is actually incredibly startup unfriendly and incredibly business unfriendly, and that has a huge effect on the growth of startup ecosystems. Infrastructure, so you really need to have good mobile phone infrastructure. You need to have very, very good broadband infrastructure if you want to grow a tech ecosystem. The other one is regulations, right? The business friendliness, not just a culture, but the business friendliness. And this is taken from my friend Benjamin Joff. Let's see this. So key thing, investors are really, really important. This is something I've observed, and this is something I see even within different regions of the U.S., is that we talk about angels, and in some countries call them devils, right? And we also have venture capitalists. This is actually incredibly important because let's just say e-commerce, right? E-commerce is a very, very big industry here in Turkey, but the challenge with e-commerce, just as one example, is that the more successful you are as an e-commerce company, the more money you actually need, right, to invest in infrastructure or whatever. So you need capital, not just in early stage, but also late stage. And one of the challenges in some countries, missing a lot of angels, and even the structure of early stage investments, where I think one challenge, particularly outside of Silicon Valley, where there's a lot more competition, and this is an issue also, frankly speaking, in New York, in Chicago, LA, is that when you might be able to get angel investments, but the challenge is that they'll take too much of your company. So you hear lots of stories of people giving up 60% of their company for whatever, 30, 40,000. It's just, this is a gross example, sometimes even 80%. And the challenge of that is that it's very, very hard to raise follow-on money. For me as a professional investor now, it's very hard for me to go into a company when the founders only own 30, 40% of the company or even less. Very, very hard for us to go in. It's a screwed up capital structure. So it's very, very hard for follow-on capital to actually jump in. And that is a big, big hindrance for basically growth, in my view. And I think the other part is actually follow-on funding. For example, this is a big challenge here in Turkey of funds, of very, very big funds of what we call growth capital. People can write $10 million, $15 million, $20 million checks. That is also a big challenge as well too, where once the companies get to a certain stage, you have to have the ability to basically do follow-on rounds to put more money to grow faster, and that's missing in certain parts of the world. Let's see. And I actually think the biggest part and the biggest driver of actually startup ecosystems is actually exits. So if you take a look at what is sort of the crystallizing point of when a startup ecosystem actually begins to get this critical mass, it's actually a very big startup exit. So for example, if you look at Jordan, the example of Jordan was actually the Maktub acquisition that I was actually involved in when I was at Yahoo. That actually caused a very, very big change in the ecosystem. It gave local entrepreneurs an example. It also gave, besides these guys who actually made money, the original entrepreneur who actually makes money, all of a sudden they have money, they're released from the company, and they have money to actually invest in the next generation of companies and next generation of startups. And these are some examples of what I think are very, very exciting startup ecosystems. Like, you look at like Israel, right? Israel kicked off back in 2002, if I recall, was ICQ. The Vardy family, Yossi Vardy, whose sons actually started ICQ, I think they sold that deal at $210 million. And one of the big sort of resulting factors, it was a great example for the local startup ecosystem. But on top of that, Yossi actually ended up investing in close to 80. He did 80 angel investments. So that really kicked off, put money into a lot of early stage companies, which actually bubbled up activity. Same thing, for example, you look at Skype in Estonia, right? Was a big, big driver for why the ecosystem is so exciting. Over there, Yandex in Russia, very, very excited by the Moscow startup scene. And it's because it's not just Yandex, but it's also Mail.ru. Many guys who actually made money, not just from investors, but also the original sort of founders, actually ended up investing in the next generation companies. City Deals, the Sammer brothers, who I know most people don't like, but this has been one of the big factors for the growth of the Berlin ecosystem. And of course, Mercado Libre in Argentina. Out of all the ecosystems actually in Latin America, Argentina has actually been one of the most exciting and actually the most, I say, dynamic when it comes to the level of startups coming out of the region. And so, the main point about this is that, and this comes from Fred Wilson, who's one of the best investors in the US, is that I always leave everything with a quote, is the entire world is not now a rival to Silicon Valley, right? That Silicon Valley, small aspects of Silicon Valley can grow all across the globe, right? So there's no country, state, region, or city has a lock on innovation technology anymore. And that's what makes me very, very excited about this region, about Europe, about Northern Asia, that there's just this great sharing of learnings and best practices now where there's a little bit of Silicon Valley in all these different places. The point is just trying to find your competitive vector. So I heard, there's a great presentation yesterday from Baresh from Intel Capital, just like capitalize on the specialities, on the expertise that your region actually has. So in Turkey, education, right? The Fatih project, I believe, is the Fatih project. Yeah, very interesting, right? They're going to put you guys so far ahead of any other countries. One of the first countries where there's a lot of big investment into infrastructure and into sort of a new education system. This is going to be a huge lead. Financial services, right? Or for example, I'm excited about like the London ecosystem for fintech. They're doing so many interesting things are happening in the financial technology space. Or for example, in New York, fashion tech. There's they're figuring out their angle of e-commerce and fashion tech and media tech and ad tech is where New York is way better than in Silicon Valley. So figure out the area, or Israel for security software is very, very exciting. So find an area that your country or region has an advantage in and some expertise and build on top of that. And that's how you're going to build your own silicon, whatever it is. All right. So I think that ends my presentation. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to speaking with all of you guys very soon.
Great. Thanks, Marvin.